Welcome to this podcast. In this podcast, I'd like to talk about Saturn in the 10th house, or Saturn in Capricorn. I'd like to start the podcast by talking about Saturn. I have a podcast already that does this, but let me reiterate, because obviously there are better and better ways to represent things that are already known. Now, in essence, traditional astrology looks at Saturn as some type of blockage system, some type of denial in a sense. Where you have Saturn is where you are restricted in that sense. And these restrictions, they seem to induce a certain type of fear. And the individual spends their time defending their ego against that fear. And most of the time, this is done unconsciously. So that when Saturn begins its process of blockage, it is usually done at a very early age, where the individual confronts an aspect of reality that spooks them. It makes them very afraid in the sense that it exposes them to a sense of guilt or a sense of shame. And the young person doesn't really know how to deal with that. They feel very vulnerable. And so they freeze in some sense. They get locked into a pattern of behavior designed to avoid that shame or that guilt. Most people, as they grow older, they begin to tell stories that negate the shame and the guilt as a way of protecting the ego. And so it is very customary for the lessons that are associated with the structure of Saturn to be ignored for many decades. They emanate again during the Saturn return, the first Saturn return, usually around the age of 29, 30, between 28 years and 30 years. And the individual begins to confront that aspect of themselves. They are thrown into environments, or they are thrown into situations where they are forced to confront that part of themselves that froze when they were little children. Okay? But what exactly is the nature of Saturn? Because like I've told you, these aspects, these functional lights, they're real things. There's an entire physics why astrology works. Now, most mainstream scientists will tell you that astrology is bullshit. In fact, it's one of the things I've had to face. I consider myself first primarily to be a scientist, one who deals with knowledge. But because part of my science includes astrology, I'm laughed out of the room. Nobody takes me seriously. They say, astrology and all that. But the problem here is that these mainstream scientists are not able to see what I see. Now, that's supposed to be a good thing because that's how breakthroughs are made. That's how people discover new things. But you have to be able to look beyond the perceived barriers, because the entire science of astrology is based on a science, on a physics that has not been invented yet, at least in the modern era. But thousands of years ago, these things were known. All right. Some people feel that humanity is at the most advanced stage it has ever been. It's a lie. I can prove it. I'm not saying it's a lie based on my feelings or my opinions or innuendos. I am saying it's a lie because it is a demonstrable lie, meaning that I can demonstrate that it is a lie. And the reasoning comes from gravitational physics. Gravitational physics. It's a thing that the extent of which is not known today. What you know today is you know about Newton, you know about Einstein. But what exactly does that mean? Okay? You have to understand what it means for the human being. That's the only way that you can really know anything. You can understand E is equals to MC squared, but the only way that you really understand it is that people use it to make nuclear reactors or they make nuclear bombs. Other than that, you don't understand what it's talking about. Okay, energy comes out of mass, so big deal. How does that affect what I'm going to have for dinner? Or how does that affect how much money is going to be in my pocket? But in order to know something properly, you have to understand its relationship to you on an everyday level. That's the only way that you can truly know it. And even though I don't want to go into the detailed explanations of the science underlying astrology, I've spoken a bit of it in one of my podcasts that I had on the space, gravitational physics and all the astrology, because astrology really is gravitational physics as implemented by bioorganic material, biochemistry. Okay? It's not that difficult to see. I teach it in a class. I have my classes where I teach the very details of this. And if you come, you join my classes, and I'll take you into the very detailed understanding of why astrology works. It's very detailed because it's very, like I told you, it's an advancement in the theory of gravity that has not been understood yet. Okay? Because in my work, I have unified all the forces of nature into a framework, one singular framework. It's more than that because the forces don't exist outside of anything else. There is only one thing. So what you call a force really is a part of an entire large structure that is the universe. Okay? So the functional light that is Saturn, even though you see it as a planet in the sky, what it really indicates is the aspect of yourself that demands it demands loftiness. It demands that you rise up, because you're not a cattle. You're not a beast. You're a human being. Okay? So it demands that you are able to elevate your consciousness to a certain height that is demanded of a human being in Aquarius. And it does that by restricting you. Now, the restriction itself is not being done by an external agency. It's being done by you. Because you can imagine your consciousness as a kind of committee. All right? Now, it's one committee, but the committee itself has different members, and each member has a certain type of weight, influence. The influence of the committee member, that is the functional light of Saturn, is very powerful. Because in that stage, the human being is mandated to rise up. And that's what it means to be a human. It's a very prerequisite function. You cannot be behaving like a cattle or a beast or something like that. Okay? Because the human being has the ability to tell beautiful stories. And the human being is actually aspiring to be able to tell the most beautiful stories possible. Now, these stories are not fantasies, because people mistake that. They make that mistake a lot. They think that you can imagine a fantasy, and you can imagine all the beautiful things in a fantasy, and then that becomes the story you're looking for. Wrong. The Saturnian part of you will never accept that, because it's BS. It doesn't mean anything. It's a lie. It's a fraud. The story that you're looking for are the stories that are already embedded in reality, in physical reality. For instance, if you look at the molecular structure of water, it's H2O. That is, two hydrogen atoms come together to bond with one oxygen atom. And they create this universal solvent. Now, if you look at the characteristics of hydrogen, and you look at the characteristics of oxygen, you don't find water in either of them. Hydrogen is an explosive gas. You put a flame next to it, you get a boop. Oxygen will rekindle a burning splint, meaning that once the fire is dying down, you add some more oxygen, it flares up again. So they have this tendency of combustibility. Okay? Yet, when they come together in the right proportion, they make a solvent that really is against that combustibility. And it now becomes a universal solvent with very special properties that allow for life to build a transport system. I don't know if you understand what I'm talking about. That's a very beautiful story. It's not a fantasy. And the more you understand it, the more you delve into the reasons why these things are happening, the more you get closer and closer to the understanding that represents the understanding of a supreme intelligence. Because as you get closer to it, you are able to perceive in greater detail the beauty and the amazingness of it all. And that's the entire point of your consciousness. Because once you drop from this level of seeking out these high beauties, the space that is vacated as you fall, that's the space that is filled by that Saturn. And so when a child is born, it is born with the ability to know these stories. That is, you are born with no knowledge in your head, basically. You are born with just drives and desires, but you don't know what you are. And yet, the human being, when it looks in the mirror, it is looking at the most intelligent thing it can ever see. When it looks around the whole of creation, it doesn't see anything comparable to it. So that intelligence is a real tangible thing. Otherwise, how can you be? So you can imagine that there is a mind that holds this intelligence. So even though you don't know what you are looking at the intelligence behind what you are, even though you don't understand it. And that now becomes a space within which you can fill it up with knowledge of self. That gap to be filled up, that is a measure of your Saturn, because that is what is going to hold you responsible. It represents that aspect of yourself that sits at a very high level. And then it looks at what you are doing, the way you are doing it, and the way that you're telling your story, and it reminds you of who you are. But in order to be able to remind you of who you are, you can't have a vacuum in your consciousness. So you populate that vacuum with something. And usually for children as they grow, this aspect that holds them responsible, it is patterned around the first authority figure they experience. And nobody teaches the child what authority is. The child intuits the nature of authority by observing what is going on in front of it. So when it observes, it comes to associate authority figures with those that determine its fate, or those that protect it, or those that whatever. Eventually, it falls around the authority of mother and father, especially father. And it begins to grade the nature of these authorities. So that what happens is that as you grow older, the distance between you where you are now and your highest expectations, they begin to take the voice of these early experiences of authority. And then everything that you will experience as authority will be patterned after those things. So that your employer, your husband or your wife or your whatever, they will be patterned after mom and dad and the relationships that you had with them. For those who don't have conventional family systems, it doesn't mean anything. The patterning is still there. They must associate something or someone as an example of authority, and then they use that to build up other concepts regarding authority. That's how it works. Okay? So that as you grow older, what you consider to be Saturn in your head is one of these authority figures speaking to you about the gap that you have between this loftiness that you should be aspiring for and where you are now. And when you go against that voice or something like that, once you deny it expression, or once you turn your face away from it, it doesn't go away. It waits for you. And then when you are at your most vulnerable, it comes back and it tells you, did I not tell you? I don't know why you're aspiring for things. You are a worthless human being. What's the point? Just pack it up, Forget about all these things. You're already worthless. And the reason why it does that is because if you tell a human being don't go right, the human being will go right. If you say don't go left, the human being will go left. Because it is only by disobeying that the human being is able to assert its own independence as an agency, as a sovereignty on its own. It's part of the quirks of being self-aware. All right? So that's really what it is. And so the restrictions come because that part of yourself is extremely powerful. It can shut you down because it can shut you down with fear. And fear is the limiting factor of a human being. Because once you are afraid, you are diminished. It means that you cannot express yourself the way that you normally would because you are terrified. And so terrorism is the ability to use fear to diminish people. And if you sustain fear on people, you diminish their capacity. You diminish them to a point where they might not even realize that they have any capacity at all. Okay? Now, there is always a counterbalancing in the psyche, because the psyche is not, if it gives that all the power, then it can crush the human being out of existence. Life can become so miserable and such a drudge or such a dredge that the human being just gives up on life. They don't want to live anymore. Because in life, it is very important that you understand that there is goodness in life. Not only do you understand it, you can feel it, you can build it. You can aspire towards it. Okay? And so the Saturnian effect is counterbalanced by the Jupiterian function. It is designed to moderate the way that you interpret the behavior of Saturn. Because that Saturn is not outside of you. It is you. And it represents where you have the loftiest potential. So that what it really wants is for you to overcome that fear. And for you to say, okay, now I'm ready for you. What can you do to me, really? Okay? So now I'm going to face that guilt. I'm going to face that shame. I'm going to face that embarrassment. And I don't care anymore. And I'm going to overcome it. Once you begin to do that and you reach a certain level of development, the Saturn itself will evaporate. It's always there, it doesn't really go away, but it doesn't have any power over you anymore. It cannot tell you that you are useless because you have evidence, tangible evidence in your reality that proves that you are not. Why? Because you've done the hard work, you've put in the effort, and you've built that tangibility. And the nature of the tangibility is that it is rooted in truth. Remember, the type of truth I talked about. Because at the end of the day, you are the one self-judging yourself. And you cannot deceive yourself, even though a lot of people try. You cannot deny yourself. So you cannot do something and then tell yourself that you're actually doing something else in a bid to try to diminish this Saturn. You will only increase it. And so the requirement for truth and evidence is paramount when overcoming this fear of Saturn. Not having that tangibility is one of the things that it used against you to hold you. But what it really wants is for you to build it. So it gives you tough love. That's it. That's how it works. All right? So when people talk about their Saturn and, Saturn transits are one of the most difficult. They're dreary in the sense that, you're going to be held to account for. But All that the Saturnian function wants you to do is to know in a very precise, very pragmatic way what you really are, who you really are, because you already know it. But that thing that you know is making you afraid, because it wants you to act in a certain way. It wants you to move in a certain way or to do things in a certain way. But those ways, they put you at cross purposes with social acceptance. And so people laugh at you. People exclude you. They may even resent you. And so in order to push these types of experiences away, the individual compromises because they want to be accepted. They want to belong. And so they shrink that part of themselves and they ignore it. And they can get away with it for 29, 30 odd years. And then it comes screaming and roaring back because you can't grow without it. And your Saturn return represents a phase transition in your reality because now you have to grow. Every human being must find their place in this world and take their place in this world. But what are you going to take and what are you going to find when you don't know who you are? When you have pushed away the understanding or the experiences that would have helped you to understand who you are. So where do you fit in? Okay? So at some point in time, this growth must occur. Now, if the first Saturn return doesn't really solve the problem, then it basically just trudges on until it gets to the second Saturn return. But one way or the other, the individual must come to realize who they are. Okay? That's how it works. Now, the 10th house is the natural house of Capricorn. So it's the natural house of Saturn itself. And so Saturn in the 10th house represents one of the most potent placements for Saturn because it contains the potential for the greatest sense of achievement. But as a result of that, it also contains the potential for the greatest type of failure. And all of it depends on how the person takes the opportunity. The fears are so magnified because it's in the 10th house. It's in the Saturnian house. The fears are so magnified that the individual runs for cover. Yes, you can imagine the type of defensive structures that the ego constructs to make sure that it doesn't experience this debilitating guilt and shame that is just waiting there, that is inside the person. Okay? It always revolves around social acceptance, the fear of being seen or the fear of not being seen, because both generate fears. The individual says, I'm not even going to try to be successful because what if I fail? Everybody laughs at me. It's the 10th house. Everybody sees what goes on there. What if I succeed and it's not good enough and people realize that my success is very brittle? It's like the individual freezes because whatever direction the self tries to take, there seems to be no pathway forward. And what happens is that the frustration and the pain builds up until it explodes. So that everyone with Saturn in the 10th house, you are going to experience a crisis point in your life. And the crisis is most likely to be public. But the crisis, if it works correctly, it is designed to allow you to overcome your fear. It is designed to allow you to overcome yourself. Because Saturn in the 10th house is the placement that suggests that your social acceptance is huge. The potential for it. You're literally sitting on a gold mine in that sense. But you don't know. Because you feel it as a deep fear, as a deep hesitation. Oh, you can choose everything, but not that. Something freaks you out about that. So you run and you go and hide. But you hide from your own gift. You hide from your own development. Most people with Saturn in the 10th house, they are leaders. Not just any type, they are world leaders. Because the establishment that accepts them, it has to do with a very high level of acceptance from a very high level of establishment. Okay? And they accept them because they have earned their place. It's not a grace or whatever you want to call it. It's not a gift. They have earned it, meaning that they can withstand challenge. And it comes from the fact that they have spent a long time learning. They have had to face that humiliation over and over and over again. They have had to confront that aspect of themselves that holds them responsible. And they have had to come up with answers to that are based in reality, that are practical, that are evidence-based. Because the evidence is constructed in the 4th house or in the sign of Cancer. They now use that as a bulwark against this unceasing examination from the Saturnian aspects of themselves. Because if you want to plant a tree, if you want the tree to grow very high, it needs to sink deep roots. The same type of thinking is employed when people want to build skyscrapers. All right, there's a ratio between how high the building has to be compared to how deep its foundation must be in order to hold it up. And that reflects the relationship between the sign of Cancer and the sign of Capricorn, or the 4th house and the 10th house. And that's what Saturn wants. Because when you know who you are and it sits within you comfortably, because all the discomforts have been resolved, they don't have to be taken away. They are just resolved, meaning that the answers you have found to those questions, they are rooted in tangible reality. So there's no shaking anymore. All right. Once that happens, your reality is open for you to go on and achieve even more. Okay. And these things typically don't happen early in the reality system. It's very rare because it requires a lot of maturity, because you have to start seeing the world in a very practical and tangible way. And most people don't realize those things until they realize that they're not going to be an astronaut. Okay. They're not going to get the girl. Then they begin to look at reality in different ways. They begin to become more pragmatic, more practical. Now, Saturn in the 10th house is not for people who don't have the capacity for great achievement, because you are going to receive a double dose. I mean, think of everywhere Saturn could be. It has come to its own house, the house where anything in that house is already under a Capricornian journey, meaning that it's not going to be easy. It's not in a form that is readily accessible to you. Okay? So in order to unlock whatever is in that 10th house, you are going to have to counterbalance the ledger with effort. And then once you're able to do that, that thing comes to you in a way that is very, very practical, very pragmatic. It contains utility because it is a seed for your ambition. And ambition is a tangible thing. You want to be successful. And you want to be successful in a way that allows you to say, look, I did that. So that it's not just about the end product. It's the fact that there is a journey associated with it. A journey that tests your character. Because the real win is that, look, I'm not like you. I'm better in a sense, in that I've been through it. I worked hard, I persevered, and I did it. So I can serve as an example for others. So that's what Saturn in the 10th house carries. It carries this worldly stature that people can look up to. All right. So a lot of world leaders, especially those that are very significant, those that appear to be teachers in some sense, not that they're actual teachers, but they're demonstrating something and people look up to them. They usually have Saturn in the 10th house. Because wherever you see it, you already know you're looking at a difficult process. Because it's not like there are no shortcuts to try to achieve ambition by bypassing some of the demands of Saturn. They are. But the problem is that if the foundation is not solid, the individual can fall. And they can fall very hard. Okay? One of the problems associated with Saturn in the 10th house or in Capricorn is the ability to follow others, to learn from others. Okay? Because the fear of humiliation publicly is very strong. And usually the sign that is generating the functional light of Saturn is an indication of where the guilt and the shame or the need to protect the ego, where it is coming from. Because that's where that's the thing that is actually going to generate the Saturn. That's where the opportunity lies, the opportunity for greatness. Saturn in the 10th house, an opportunity for greatness, is a very significant placement. It doesn't come into reality systems that, that just everyday. No. Once you have that, you know that there is a connection between you. And once you look at, for instance, the G20 leaders, you can see them, G20, right? They're a set of countries, 20 different countries with a certain type of GDP. And you see all the people standing there, right? That's what you're really connected to in some sense. I'm not saying that that is the only group available per se. But you're connected to something like that because there's an aspect of you that already knows that you have the capacity for that type of thing. The problem now becomes, are you going to be able to rise to that capacity? Are you going to? Because you will hear that capacity as a judgment in your head. It will always tell you that, why do you even need to try for this capacity? You're already useless. What is the point? You think you can ever be one of these people? You think you're going to be a great man. You're not even a man. I mean, these are things that can be very debilitating, especially in your vulnerable moments when you experience failure. And Saturn in the 10th house has its own fair share of public failure, humiliations on levels that are very difficult to cope with. But that is the opportunity and that is the test, because the test itself is a test of character. Because, what it's doing there is that it's going to ask you questions regarding the nature of your integrity, the nature of this highness or this loftiness that you think that you are. And so what is it really? What is the tangibility behind it? A very important stage in the developmental sequence of Saturn in the 10th house or in Capricorn is a statement regarding the relationship with the father. Most times when you have Saturn in the 10th house or Saturn in Capricorn, the relationship with the father is strained. And it all comes from this sense of authority, because when you have Saturn in the 10th house or in Capricorn, you are born to be an authority. And so there is a natural clash between you as a budding authority and the authority as symbolized by your father. or are symbolized by your employer, or are symbolized by the government. Okay? And the degree of that clash is dependent on the sign that is generating that Saturn. And so Saturn in the 10th house or in Capricorn feels like a weighted or a weighty expectation from authority or from the father that is compelling you to behave in a certain way, a way that you may not want to behave like, because you have your own ideas of what your own personal authority should be. Okay? Now, this creates a sense of fear regarding failure or regarding not living up to expectation or not living up to tradition, etc., etc., etc. So the individual is trapped in this structure, which is now generating a Saturn for them because they're constantly being judged according to the dictates of that authority structure. All right? They have to free themselves from it. And sometimes the only way to do that is to just destroy everything. The ego then needs to be destroyed so that it can experience that fear. And by experiencing that fear, it is released from it. And that nullifies the power of that Saturn. Because the power of that Saturn in the 10th house is all about the ego. Because the 10th house is one of the most visible places that the ego can express itself. And so it's locked into a pattern whereby the ego does not want to be humiliated. It doesn't want to feel as if it has the weight of the world on its head. And yet, it must go in that direction. All right. So people who have Saturn in the 10th house, they usually experience some type of public failure at some point in time. So as to free them from that thing, so that it is only by being freed from the constrictions that are created by those expectations that the individual can now go on to become their greatest success. I'm not saying that this is the pattern that happens all the time. It's just very common. All right. Now, Saturn in the 10th house also may make it difficult to play several types of roles, like being a father yourself or being a parent yourself, because these are people who take responsibility to a very different level because it represents a significant source of fear for them. Okay. So there are many things that can happen in those areas. Usually people with Saturn in the 10th house, they usually have a lot going on in Scorpio and Sagittarius because it is Sagittarius that builds Capricorn. And Sagittarius can only be built from Scorpio. So that's why natal chart synthesis is always very important, to understand precisely how that demand of Saturn in the 10th house, how is it being met? Because God cannot give you a task without the resources to meet that task. It's not punishment. Okay? So these are very important things. And that's why I always tell people, don't look at your placements in isolation. There's always a temptation to do so. But it is most likely that you are wrong. Because the entire thing exists as one structure. And everything is in everything in some sense. And you have to understand how to read it. That's why I decided to start teaching natal chart synthesis. The technique that I use. Largely the technique that I developed. Because it comes from the principles of organized complexity. Because now we're looking at the chart and we're treating it as a complex system. No different from any other complex system. And the thing about complex system is that the intelligence in it is contained within the organization. Because organization is the way that God expresses his supreme intelligence. So it doesn't matter what you're looking at, physics, chemistry, biology, whatever. What you're really looking at is the nature of organization within those types of discourses. The mistake we make is that we tend to think that these discourses exist by themselves. They don't. There's really no physics. There's really no chemistry. There's really no biology. There's really no astrology. These things belong to one system only, one underlying way of understanding things. And that is why I developed the 5 principles of organized complexity. Because when you look at things from that perspective, then you're looking at everything, really. And you're looking at how everything is connected to everything. Okay? So in the classes, I teach how to extract the meaning from the natal chart, so that you can be able to see what it really means. Okay, because Saturn in the 10th house means this. Yes, but look at the way it's sitting. Look at how it's interacting. Look at the sign that's generating it. Because it takes you around all the other narratives in the natal chart. Because there's only one narrative. And for those who have listened to my podcast on Kamala Devi Harris and Donald John Trump, you see, you get a feel for how I'm connecting these narratives together. Like in Donald Trump's natal chart now, the conclusion is basically simple. This man is looking for the evidence of love. Why? Because the space for that was created very early in his formative years. But the type of space that was created, it had a mismatch with the way that space was interacted with. Let me put it that way. And it has to do with the difference between the sign of Aquarius and the sign of Cancer. And that creates a gap. Because now that gap must be filled. And you know, in order to go from Cancer to Aquarius, you have to go the sign of Cancer, the sign of Leo, the sign of Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, before you get to Aquarius. And so the life story revolves around that. So ultimately, he's matching to Aquarius in some sense. And the quality of the Aquarius that he meets depends on the journey. And you know what Aquarius is? Aquarius is an intellectual group. It's a social group, but it's not about pure social, like in Libra and all that. No, Aquarius is the loftiness of knowledge because it comes from Capricorn. Okay? So by the time you get to Aquarius, the ego is so elevated. It's so huge. It's so big. But that bigness, that largeness, it has to come from the integrity of knowledge. And I've told you what knowledge is. All knowledge comes from organizational intelligence. Every aspect of it. Okay? They're not different knowledges per se. Every knowledge comes from organizational intelligence, right? And the most amazing, the most complex organizational intelligence that you know of is you. There's nothing more than it's literally you. When you stare in the mirror, you're looking at something that it's almost impossible. And yet there it is. Because the intelligence that is making it happen is a supreme intelligence. So there's really nothing it cannot do. Okay? And that is the knowledge that Aquarius is looking for. It is the knowledge that you find in all humanity. So it's a knowledge of self in that sense. Okay? Now, so the pathway that Donald John Trump had to take is he must discover this truth for himself. And that's why the evidence of love was denied him, so that he can populate this gap. And the narratives in the natal chart are simple like that. They're simple like that, but it can go through an entire lifetime trying to look for precisely what it is that is going on. Okay? And the interpretations you come across, because that's how we all define ourselves. We pursue different interpretive pathways. But what if we take on the wrong one? Because if you look at Donald John Trump today, the group he's energizing, is it really an Aquarian group? Because whatever the answer to that question is, it is reflective of the way that this journey has been interpreted by him. That's how these things are. So when you come for your own natal chart synthesis, this is what you are going to hear. It's very different from every other type of astrology that you've heard before. You will hear something that is very, very primal, very pristine. And you can go think about it yourself. You can think about it and ask yourself if it is true. Okay? Because all our narratives are very simple things, really. Very, very simple things. And when you have Saturn in the 10th house or Saturn in Capricorn, well, part of the simplicity revolves around coming to terms with the possibility or the potential for public humiliation. But you can counterbalance that with effort. You can take the time to undergo periods of learning where you are small. You're hanging out around big things and big people and they laugh at you, so what? But you're small. And as you are small, you are learning. And then you begin to grow. And then you grow. And then you grow. And one day you're the boss. There's nobody above you anymore. Nobody to laugh at you anymore. And then you can take the opportunity to teach people that there is a better way to go through this process. You don't have to laugh at people. And you can create opportunities where people can grow without that fear. And all natal charts, I'll tell you something now. All natal charts, because you're a human being and you are here in the service of God, whether you realize it or not, because God is not a religious concept. It's not a religious reality. And the way that that is realized is that your life is not just important to you. It is important to a whole lot of people that you are going to meet. And so your natal chart contains that aspect of how you are going to elevate the reality around you. Because that is the light that you carry inside of you. That's why it's important to know what that story is. Okay? And those who have Saturn in the 10th house or in Capricorn, they feel this grandiosity much. They feel it a lot. They know that at some point in time, their world or their reality will involve being in a position of authority, having an impact on the reality systems of people. And that's what they're being prepared for. Okay? So if you want to have your own natal chart synthesis, reach out to me. My details are always in the video description. Always. You can send me an email. You can go to my website and book your reading directly. You have to pay for it there on the website. Or you can send me a WhatsApp message if you have questions regarding what a booking is or what a synthesis really is. Now, I've put example synthesis on my YouTube channel so you can listen to what it sounds like. Especially if people are going to be worried about what the after effects of a synthesis really is. Because sometimes there are some truths that are perceived on a level that makes it very difficult to integrate, very difficult to accept. And sometimes you can hear things that really go right to the core of your being. Now, the entire point of a synthesis is that it triggers a change in behavior. Because the idea is that now that you have a better grasp of the person that is actually doing the reality itself, then you make better decisions, especially where self-value is concerned. And that should lead you to your success. And like I said before, success doesn't mean money for everybody. Everybody's chart is sitting in a different way. And even though everybody needs money to live, not everybody wants money. Not everybody is looking to be a billionaire or a multimillionaire. Some people, peace is just enough. Love is just enough. But they don't know this because they want to belong, so they hustle with everybody. But their heart is never really in it. Okay? And they begin to feel like they're failures and things like that. That's not the way that it works. Everybody needs what they need. And you cannot change who you are, at least not on that level. So I do have ways that I address this post-synthesis reality. There's a time period when you can come for a consultation, live consultation via Zoom. And we can discuss whatever concerns you have. It's free. It's already part of the service. That is, if you want it, because the synthesis itself is detailed enough. Most people don't really need it. But if you want to ask questions concerned with the post-synthesis adjustment period and how the adjustments are meant to be, then you can use that session. And then after the session is over, obviously further sessions are going to be billed at my hourly rate. But they also always represent opportunities to go into the heart of the matter even more. Okay? And if you want, if a client needs it, I can design a post-synthesis transition period that is filled with certain types of milestones. Now, they're expectations, but they're not hard and set expectations. I am not your authority figure, so to speak. Okay? I'm more like a guide. Based on the synthesis as it sits, then this is the most likely transition that you can experience. This is how long it's going to take. And I get paid for that. Okay? Not every synthesis will be as complex or as mundane. No, it all depends on the story that is encoded within the natal chart, because each of our lives are unique things. We're all different people looking for different things in some sense. Okay? All right.